Okay, I don't usually run the show here. That's Professor Germain. But I was 2 minutes ago. I was drafted into introducing today's guest speaker, and that is quite appropriate. Kevin McMillan, who's an assistant professor at the University of Ottawa, was in fact my roommate in graduate school. So
you know each other intimately.
We know one another intimately, that's true. And as I already mentioned, in the PhD proposal workshop this year, you learn as much or sometimes more from your roommates as you will ever learn in the classroom, and I think that is definitely true in this case. Kevin has taught me a great deal, and I would hope to think that he learned a few things from me as well. No, all of this is to say we had very interesting and productive conversations around the kitchen table in north of Central Park in 110th Street in New York quite a few years ago. Kevin's main field of interest is international relations, specifically diplomatic history, and I'm not even sure how I would label his approach. It is a somewhat practice-oriented approach, but I would not call it sort of practice theoretical, because that would put him into a particular box in IR, which I don't think he really wants to be in. But he certainly engages with practice theoretical work in IR. But Kevin also has wide-ranging interests beyond IR in the philosophy of science and social science, in economics, and in a number of empirical subjects as well, but his expertise is clearly in IR and in diplomatic history, although today I think he will be talking about some of his more meta-theoretical work related to reflexivity, but I don't know what it's going to be, so I will let him continue. So it's a pleasure to welcome you, Kevin, to our department.
Thanks so much, Hans-Martin, for that very detailed introduction, and I most certainly did learn a great deal as well from our kitchen conversations. I'm very happy to be here, and thank you so much for the invitation. It will be kind of a more abstract kind of talk, as you possibly could tell from the title, and I will start off by talking about the title and about my abstract. I have my favorite philosopher, Ian Hacking, once gave a talk that I attended. It was a debate with a mathematician on the nature of mathematics or something like that, and he spent the entire talk basically going over his opponent's abstract and taking it apart. I won't quite impose that on you, but what I will do is maybe diminish some of the expectations or clarify some of the things. It's a bit of a pretentious title and a bit of an overwhelmingly ambitiously phrased abstract, perhaps. It's Randy's fault, really. He forced me to change the original title just because I was actually presenting it somewhere else. But yes, why not, huh? The talk is supposed to have both a wider and a narrower scope than what it sounds like. I am very much interested in the relationship between what I might broadly call cultural phenomena and human action. And what I want to do is to talk, perhaps spend the first bit talking about a few different ways in which that relationship has been understood, and to use the theme of reflexivity as a kind of umbrella label to gather these different approaches, because reflexivity is something that they share in common. I'll talk a little bit more about what I mean by that, and I'm going to spend some time, or pay more attention perhaps than is often done when discussing reflexivity, and talking about some fairly conventional social scientific models about the relationship between human thought, let's say, or what I might call cultural phenomena, and human action as a way of understanding social phenomena. And I want to basically, the one thing that I want to do is point out something rather simple about a fundamental characteristic that they seem to share about how it is that we should think about the relationship between the way that people think, or their awareness, or their reflections, and the kinds of things that they do, and thereby the kinds of social phenomena that get produced. And then I want to sketch a somewhat, in a very sketchy fashion, which is far more worked out in other work that I've done, but just kind of the bare bones of some alternative ideas about what the relationship, I say it in the singular, there's not just one, of course, between cultural phenomena and their effects on action might be. And again, I have to qualify all of this. When I talk about cultural phenomena, I'm wary of the term culture. It can mean different things to different people. I'm particularly wary of it as in the nominal form, as a noun. I don't mind talking about cultural as an adjective. One anthropologist refers to this as a lexical avoidance strategy. I plead guilty. But it's supposed to stand for a wide variety of phenomena, whether we talk about discourse, identity, knowledge, awareness, unconscious processes, the normative aspects of social life, and so on. It'll also be narrower in the sense that I'm going to focus on one particular form, broad form. Reflexivity can mean many different things. In fact, I'm going to focus on a form that is probably more common in the social sciences, but when it comes to international relations in particular, where reflexivity has been a fairly big topic in the last 10 years in certain quarters, the discussion has tended to focus on other forms of reflexivity, in particular the reflexivity of theory. And that's something that I will not really be focusing on. So I'm really looking at perhaps a more ontological, although I hesitate to make that distinction, as opposed to an epistemological understanding of reflexivity. That is to say, I'm interested in how it is that human self-awareness is involved in shaping the phenomena that it is aware of. And so, just quickly, reflexivity, generally speaking, has to do with, or is usually taken to refer to the importance of human self-awareness and the kinds of recursive effects that human self-awareness can have, both on our own awareness, our own understanding of ourselves, but also perhaps more concretely on the kinds of things that we do, on the practices we engage in, and thereby on the kinds of phenomena, the regular phenomena that characterize the social world. The form that I'm going to be focusing on is this latter one, the idea that the very awareness of or expectation of a particular phenomenon can exert effects on the phenomenon itself, can alter it, can shape it in some way, can stabilize it. So the classic image of that is the self-fulfilling prophecy, for example. The very belief in something may actually bring about that very outcome, bring it to life, as it were. And a lot of the examples I will be focusing on will be in this vein. I'll look at it very quickly at a couple from economics, just because it's not a place where one normally thinks about in connection with reflexivity. And in fact, I'm going to pick on a couple of models that have gotten a lot of bad press since the 2008 global financial crisis, namely the efficient markets hypothesis and the rational expectations argument. But also I'm going to throw in there something very closely related to the whole logic, which is the idea of the Lucas critique of policy and the use of econometric analysis to try to make policy on the basis of past data. Again, very quickly, just to point out some things that they share and some interesting parts of the logic, in my opinion. There's also we can also talk about the relationship between theory and the real world, or the relationship between the production of knowledge and the object of knowledge, or between the knower and the known, or the subject and the object of knowledge. And that works in both directions. We can think about how it is that perhaps our theories may shape in some way the world around us, the social world around us. But we can also talk about the ways in which that world feeds into our theories, so that there are certain conditions in which we create our theories, and that our theories may very much reflect those. There's other arguments that have been made in this vein, more normative arguments, that theorists should try to be as self-reflexive as possible, and therefore, for example, think as much as they can about the kinds of influences that may have conditioned the production of their knowledge, that theories should try to be accountable to the very standards that they themselves use, so that there's a kind of internal consistency to them, and finally, looking at not just at the ways in which the real world shapes our theories, but also the ways in which our theories may shape the world. What are the possible effects of our theorizing, and and then, as an ethical question, to what extent should we reflect on this? Should we try to think as much as possible about likely or possible effects of our theorizing, and then to take some degree of responsibility for it, as some people have argued. Those aspects of reflexivity are all super interesting. They're just not what I'm going to be focusing on here, because I'm trying to keep it more narrowly focused, and also because, to some extent, they have received much more attention in a lot of the literature on reflexivity, at least in my home subfield of international relations. Good. Let's start by talking about the so-called efficient markets hypothesis. It's, like I said, it's gotten a lot of bad press. It seems to be almost by definition, at least in a popular understanding of what it's all about, it seems almost by definition to be invalidated by the events of the 2008 financial crisis. Certainly, that's probably the popular approach. It has also been vigorously defended by some of its proponents. Not terribly convinced of those defenses. But what I'm interested in, first of all, the efficient markets hypothesis, very, very quickly, starts off with a very basic idea or a basic observation, doing kind of statistical analyses of financial market prices of stocks in the financial market. People noticed that, in fact, or it was allegedly discovered that there were not, in fact, consistent patterns across time, and so therefore the argument being that ultimately financial markets are unpredictable. Okay, that strikes me as somebody perhaps is a little bit outside of the mainstream of much social science, sometimes critical of some of the pretensions of some social science. That strikes me as eminently plausible. And strikes me as a very interesting insight, something that is potentially quite subversive of the whole enterprise of perhaps developing, permanent explanatory models of financial economics. I picked these three cases in economic theory and finance theory because in every case there's an interesting and in some ways subversive insight at the core of it, which then gets turned around by what strike me as a feat of logic into something that actually shores up neoclassical economics or the versions of that transmute into finance theory. The explanation, the efficient markets hypothesis says, why are there no predictable patterns? Why are stock market prices unpredictable? It's because markets are efficient. If information is available, what markets do is they incorporate all available information into the prices of stocks and anything else that's being valued on the market. And as a result of that, any inefficiencies, any irrationalities that there could possibly be, any regularities, any patterns that might show up, are instantly taken advantage of by these hyper-rational traders who will notice them, who look at, constantly poring over the data and poring over information if there's, stocks decline on Fridays, they're going to take advantage of that because there's a profit to be made. The very fact that they take advantage of it, in and of itself, undoes the efficiency. It eliminates the inefficiency, rather, as it's called, or the pattern itself, thereby restoring the unpredictability and therefore the so-called random walk of statistical mathematical term, just saying basically that there's no patterning, long-term patterning in financial stock prices. There's ever stronger versions. So we talk about the efficient markets hypothesis. We usually talk about the weak version, which is just that stock prices are a random walk. There's usually a semi-strong version, which says that traders, rational traders, operate on the basis of all publicly available information. So anything that's out in the public, they can then take advantage of that information and eliminate all inefficiencies that way. So, for example, price data is publicly available. We can all go look at years and years of past prices of stocks, so we can take advantage of that and thereby eliminate any inefficiencies that arrive through regular self-interested profit taking or profit pursuit. There's a strong version of that which says that markets are perfectly efficient in the sense that they simply incorporate all information that is possibly relevant to any stock prices. So, anything that, and in a sense, this is, in my mind, somewhat insane. But I mean, this is part of the ideas of rational choice that many of you will be familiar with. There is, in a sense, almost perfect foresight about everything that could possibly happen in the future. It's not quite perfect foresight, in fact, because the introduction of uncertainty or statistical probability means that rather than knowing everything that will ever happen in the future, traders only know exactly what the precise probability distributions for every single event that might happen in the future are. Whether there is, if this is a distinction without a difference, it's up to you to decide. But that strikes me as an equally far-fetched claim. But it's reflexivity, right? Because in this sense, we have a phenomenon that by the very awareness of the existence of a phenomenon, it is thereby changed, it is thereby altered or undone. Okay, and again, we don't think about economics typically in terms of reflexivity. And what is interesting is how one gets from the logic of the argument that one gets from there not being any predictability and there not being any constant patterns or regularities over time to, this means that the market must be perfectly efficient. From, again, the way that I would see it would that in many ways the unpredictability of the market would mean the impossibility of genuinely rational expectations in this sense. Would kind of suggest exactly the opposite conclusion of the one that is made. There's all kinds of things one might question. There's all kinds of critiques of the EMH. I'm not going to go into too much detail, but what I wanted to suggest is, for one thing, one of the problems is that we're looking for allegedly uniform permanent patterns. Okay? Why should we expect that? If the market is unpredictable because that's just the way that human beings are, for example, okay, and social phenomena themselves are not permanent, okay, then we would expect to have an unpredictable market, and we would expect to have patterns that only last for a certain period of time, and that disappear as people's behavior changes. A lot of work is done by the very labeling of any patterns as inefficiencies. Okay, a lot of conceptual and rhetorical work is done by this. First of all, it makes it sound like it's a thing, rather than, for example, and it also makes it very plausible that what traders are doing when they react to that is basically taking advantage of and eliminating the inefficiency. Whereas one might think of it as simply, people become aware of something and they simply pile on. So they start responding to that, often in very diverse ways. And so the fact that the pattern disappears may be less reflective of it going back to some kind of ideal equilibrium state as if there is such a thing, but rather that it's basically as soon as people become aware of something, their practices change, and therefore, the patterns themselves change of behavior. So seeing, this as unpredictability is something that lies at the heart of human activity and human thought. If stock markets really are fundamentally unpredictable, they're not even predictable in the sense that they have, one single equilibrium point that they kind of converge around or something. Then, treating unpredictability as something that's fundamentally ontological, that is characteristic of the phenomena themselves, rather than something that is about uncertainty in the minds of traders or in the minds of rational actors, I think then gives us many other kinds of possibilities for interpreting what's going on there. The Lucas critique, again, a famous criticism, and if you know of Mr. Lucas, he's a famous responsible for developing business cycle theory. He was one of the huge critics that participated in the kind of demise of Keynesianism in the 1970s, partly because of the so-called Lucas critique, in which he argued that many policy measures were simply ineffectual because the very fact of announcing a policy measure, for example, or of introducing a policy measure would actually radically change the structural parameters of the economy in which that policy was being introduced. So, this was part of a kind of anti-government intervention line and so on. This is the resurgence of neoclassical economics, or at least a particular version of them, away from the kind of synthesis with Keynesianism that Paul Samuelson had made famous. And I think there's an insight there, which is that there is no fixed policy environment. There is no fixed structure of society or of an economy and so on. And the very fact of intervening and the very fact of acting in any kind of large-scale way is going to obviously create changes. Again, what's interesting is the way that this is kind of assumed to be a purely self-negating phenomenon, right? Like with traders removing inefficiencies in stock market prices back to some presumed equilibrium, the same idea with the Lucas critique is that, well, basically any policy is undone, the moment that it's known about. And if we assume purely rational actors, they may know about that policy even before it's enacted or even before it's announced. Okay, so it exactly reverses the phenomenon itself. Therefore, we have some idea of some kind of a baseline or an equilibrium state or a central tendency, to use a statistical term, around which we can have variations, but which we're always coming back to this convergent point. And I think that this idea about the way in which, in many ways, this shows how it is that economics and neoclassical economic theory is able to rescue from something rather hard, in fact, in many ways, extremely difficult to model and very difficult to think about in any kind of a static fashion. How it is that human thought and human awareness can feed back on the very phenomena, thereby changing them. I'm going to skip over rational expectations to just briefly touch on a couple of other examples. We see a lot of the same kind of discussion when in forms of systems theory across the social sciences, or in international relations theory, for example, and in discussions, for example, of path dependence, which has been a very, very hot topic for the last 15 years or so. And so, for example, if you take the work of Paul Pearson, who's a historical institutionalist, who's really is lauded by his fellow historical institutionalists as having presented one of the more rigorous versions of, or understandings of path dependence. It's very much all about positive feedbacks. Okay, so again, path dependence is another idea that actually starts in economics or in understandings of attempts to understand market failure and certain kind of how certain paths how certain outcomes may in fact embody inefficiencies or irrational outcomes, despite the availability of superior, more efficient outcomes initially. And so, it's like the whole VHS versus beta thing. It's often developed in the context of thinking about technology and why it is that certain technologies take off and others do not. And that even if one technology or two technologies were equally technologically efficient at the time, they equally appealing to people, for whatever reason, one of them takes off and then locks in its advantages through a cycle of positive feedbacks. And so this is a way of explaining the difference between stability and change over time. There are these kind of turning points at which small changes can have massive differences, and then once they're entrenched, every subsequent use of that product, every time you buy a VHS video machine or some manufacturer then creates a VHS machine, I realize that I'm dating myself with these references. So it's just the famous example in the literature, the most popular one. If I knew what the competitor Blu-ray was, I would have said that. But anyways, HDV. I'll take your word for it. Nicely done. Anyways, so anyways, but what is interesting about this way of seeing, again, understanding the way in which human thought shapes human action is by basically reproducing more of the same. Okay, that's the whole idea behind a positive feedback. Okay, with the examples from economics that we just discussed, we're talking about negative feedbacks, where you have a particular phenomenon, but awareness of the phenomenon makes that phenomenon reduce in size or even get eliminated altogether. Here we're talking about positive feedbacks, where awareness of the phenomenon makes people do more and more and more of the same, which increases and amplifies the phenomenon. Okay? Again, a reflexive dynamic, even though it's typically not the language that we use to think about these things. I could talk about what it is that I find problem. Obviously, the attention to positive feedbacks is not entirely is not wrong. There are insights to be gained there, and so on. What I want to point out is just the narrowness of the conception of how it is that our thoughts and our actions relate to one another in that. I'll quickly shift to the literature on ideas in international relations and political science. You can go back to some of the literature from 1993, Cohen and Goldstein, for example, Ideas in Foreign Policy. There's a lot of work on ideas in the relationship to policy. And in every case, okay, and the most recent books, the most recent volumes that I found, Goffas and Hay and Bélan and the other editor, but anyways, 2010, 2012, same kinds of themes, in which the assumption always is that the way that ideas, for lack of a better term, have effects is by reproducing reality in their own image. Okay? It is by creating a concrete material version of what it is that they imagine. So, Keynesian ideas produce Keynesian policies. Peter Hall and all the literature that flowed from him. And you can play this endlessly. You can take any chapter from any of these books on ideas, and roughly this is more or less the notion of the efficacy of ideas that is being presented. There's obviously, again, something to this idea, but it strikes me as incredibly narrow, and it strikes me as running the risk of, in many ways, limiting our understanding of the amazing efficacy of human thought and its relationship to human action, the amazing diversity of the kinds of effects that people's thought and their awareness can have. And so we have this still somewhat surreal to me debate about whether ideas even matter in politics or something like that. Which, I mean, again, most political scientists possibly will say, of course that's a legitimate debate. It strikes me as surreal. And I think it's a very limited understanding of what it is, of how it is that we could think about the efficacy and the effects of ideas that makes us fall into that kind of a trap. It's also the kinds of ways in which we think about effects in general and causality. I think that is at play here. And so I want to suggest that maybe that's not necessarily the best way to be thinking about these problems. And even in literature outside of mainstream social science, let's take the literature on performativity and economic performativity in particular. There's a lot of really interesting literature in economic sociology now looking at the ways in which economics and economic theory is not, in the words of its most famous popularizer, Donald Mackenzie, not just a camera, but an engine. Okay? It is actively embedded. He looks at financial markets and particular options markets and the ways in which there is a particular formula, the Black-Scholes-Merton formula, for options pricing becomes embedded. It's used by the practitioners themselves. It becomes the common sense. And people who know a little bit about the global financial crisis may have heard about the role that Black-Scholes-Merton, among other things, among other beliefs, played in the evaluation of derivatives, in the kind of creation of new forms of these very innovative financial instruments, for lack of a better term, and so on. And so this is really useful. There's been a critique of some of this literature which has said, in many ways, it's just patting neoclassical economics on the back. It's basically saying that, in not so many words, that neoclassical economics has created a world, an economy, that is based on its assumptions and therefore, looking more and more like neoclassical economics. And Donald Mackenzie kind of says something like this. Yeah, the price data, initially was very divergent from the Black-Scholes-Merton, and now over time it seems to converge on the predictions of the model as the model is increasingly deployed. Again, there can be a lot of insights drawn from this. What is problematic to me is the narrowness of the conception of, again, ideas. If economic theory has effects on the economy, it must be because economic theory is making the economy look like economic theory models the economy. Whereas that, again, strikes me as an extremely narrow way of understanding the kinds of effects that... what do I propose? I'm going to give a couple of quick examples. For one thing, I'm just going to focus on, rather than ideas or cultural phenomena in particular, I'm going to focus on concepts, because this is what I tend to focus on in my own work. By concepts, I simply mean, again, to use my favorite philosopher, Hacking, he refers to them as words in their sights. So words are word phrases, that have, are embedded in a particular socio-historical context, are used in particular ways by particular people for particular purposes with particular senses in particular contexts. Take, for example, the concept of sexual harassment. Pivotal moral concept that emerges in the 1970s. That has shaped our world, the world we know even here at the university, in so many different ways. One reason for picking that concept, the example, is simply, the effects that the emergence of the concept of sexual harassment have had are in no way obviously limited. I mean, in many ways have nothing to do with. They don't make the world in their own image. They don't, hopefully, stimulate acts of sexual harassment, for example. What they have permitted is the emergence of new forms of experiencing past experiences, new ways of creating workplace campaigns, new ways of looking at everyday interactions or things that people say, new understandings of the self and new forms of identity, new basis for, very concretely, legal reforms, political changes, the armamentarium of a broader women's movement, for example, and all the vast changes that it's exerted over the past 45 years, and so on and so forth. None of these are necessarily about the concept of sexual harassment creating a world in its own image, whatever that would even mean with that case. I'll give another example, which perhaps is less narrowly focused. The concept of globalization. Okay, there's another buzzword that we've all heard of and that we've all perhaps rolled our eyes at some point because it is such a buzzword. If we think about the concept and the kinds of effects that it's had since it's emerged in the world, okay, it has made all kinds of things possible that literally were not possible to do, at least in their very specific forms originally. Ranging from trying to improve the digital divide to anti-globalization movements, to using globalization as an excuse to, before the public, we had no choice. We have to race to the bottom, or whatever the claim is. The number of effects that it has had since emerging, and over time as it is transformed in its context, have been in many ways endless and infinite. And it is only a very narrow conception of what kinds of effects that concepts or ideas can have that restricts our view from that. I also want to suggest, and it's implicit in some of the ways that I've been speaking, is that often our focus on the relationship between ideas and action, or concepts and action, should be more what I would tend to call constitutive rather than causal in its focus. Part of the problem is precisely because we're trying to fit the efficacy of cultural phenomena into a mold of causal phenomena, largely modeled on the experience of statistical inference. And lo and behold, we shouldn't be surprised that this kind of thing shows that, in fact, ideas are inconsistent causes. I don't have a problem with the category of causation. I don't have a problem. It's not about neglecting causal analysis, and indeed a suitably expanded notion of causal analysis would suit me just fine. But there is a difference that I'd like to point out. There's a difference between explaining why a phenomenon occurs and explaining why a phenomenon exists. Causal analysis, in its traditional conception, explains why it is that particular instances of a general phenomenon take place. Okay? So what you do is you line up the cause and you line up the effect, and you see if they happen, roughly simultaneously. So there is a consistent presence between the instances of the effect and the instances of the cause. Okay? You claim that is causation. I would argue the Constitution operates differently. Constitution has to do with the existence and with the features or the characteristics of a phenomenon. So if we're talking about a human practice, for example, a regular form of behavior, okay, that in many ways concepts serve as the condition of the possibility, okay, the condition of the emergence of certain forms of behavior if they're identified in all their specificity. Okay? And what that means is that rather than trying to use the typical social scientific concepts that we use, which tend to be very abstract, what I like to call functional concepts, where there's a wide variety of different kinds of empirical things that could instantiate the concept. we should try to identify social phenomena and human behaviors, different forms of human behaviors, as closely as possible in the context in which they occur, and as much specificity as we can. That doesn't give up the goal of generalizing in any way. Okay? It just means that generalization occurs within a particular socio-historical context. And in many ways, I think it strengthens the kinds of generalizations that one can make when one identifies concepts, human practices, and other forms of social phenomena in all their specificity relative to a specific historical context. I know that I've probably just raised way more questions than I can possibly answer, but I'm going well over time, and so I thought that maybe I'd just leave it there, and then if you have further questions, I'm happy to elaborate further on something. I just wanted to put some of these out there. Anyways, thank you.